Assalamu alaikum. Today we will discuss the development of the eye. For the development of the eye, you must know that it develops on the 22nd day of development. On the 22nd day of development, what will happen? There is the closure of the neural folds, and the neural folds closure form the neural tube. And when the neural tube is formed, then three brain vesicles are formed, which are forebrain vesicle, midbrain vesicle, and the hindbrain vesicle. So I have drawn this forebrain vesicle. This is the forebrain vesicle. So on the 22nd day of development, what will happen? Firstly, on the lateral sides of the forebrain vesicles, there is development of the optic groove. Here are the optic groove on each side of the forebrain vesicle. Later on, this groove will be converted into the optic vesicle. As you can see, this one is the optic vesicle. Then in the later on in the development, this optic vesicle is indented inside and it takes the shape of optic cup. Now this is the optic cup. Before starting in detail the development of the eye, you must know the sources which are required or which are participating in the development of the eye. The sources are the surface ectoderm. This is the surface ectoderm, and also the forebrain ectoderm and the neural cross cells. These all structures are participating in the formation of the eye. These are the sources for the development of the eye. So we have discussed that on the lateral side of the forebrain vesicle, there is a development of the optic groove, which will later on form the optic vesicle, and later on this optic vesicle develop an indentation which will form the optic cup. When the indentation will develop, then what will happen? This optic cup will have two layers, the outer layer and the inner layer. In this diagram, this is the diagram of the optic cup. When we enlarge, this is the optic cup, and you can see there are two layers, the outer layer and the inner layer. This is the optic cup, and this optic cup is connected to the forebrain vesicle through a stalk which is known as the optic stalk. And you should keep it in mind, when the indentation at the level of the optic cup, this indentation also occurs inferiorly. So here there is the development of a fissure which is known as the choroidal fissure. Here will be the development of the choroidal fissure, which will later on close. So now the optic cup has developed. Now we will discuss the development of the retina. Retina will develop from the optic cup. You can be asked in the objective or the MCQ questions, from where the retina develops. Your answer should be retina develops from the optic cup. Now we will discuss in detail the development of the retina. So now we have the two layers of the optic cup, the outer layer and the inner layer. The outer layer will form the pigmented layer of the retina, and the inner layer is divided into the anterior fifth part and the posterior 4/5 part. When we see in the diagram, you can see this is the anterior fifth part and this is the posterior fifth part. The posterior fifth part is further divided into the mantle layer and the layer of rods and cones. This mantle layer is further divided into the inner ganglionic layer, outer ganglionic layer, and the granule cell layer. These are the three layers which will be developed from the mantle layer, inner ganglionic layer, outer ganglionic layer, and the ganglionic cell layer. These are all the layers of the retina and the rods and cones layer. While the anterior fifth part will develop the pars iridica retini, pars iridica retini and pars cystica retini, ciliaris retini. So from the anterior fifth part, what will be developed? Iris and the ciliary body. while from the posterior fifth part, the remaining layers of the retina will develop rods and cones, inner ganglionic, outer ganglionic and the granule cell layer. While the outer layer of the optic cup will participate in the formation of the pigmented layer. You should keep in mind what is the difference between the outer layer and the inner layer of the retina. Outer layer, which is the pigmented layer, this is the toughest layer and it absorbs the most intensity of the light, while the inner layer is on inside and this is thin as compared to the pigmented layer. So before reaching the light into the rods and cones, the light first reach the pigmented layer, which is outside, okay, and then it will reach the inner side. I hope you understand the development of the retina. Now we'll discuss the development of the lens. This is a very important question for the second year MBBS students. In the development of the lens, you must know that the lens developed by the inductive influence of the optic cup. Now, if we see that this is the optic cup, as I told you, this was the optic cup which have the choroidal fissure beneath. This optic cup is surrounded by the surface ectoderm. This is the surface ectoderm. So, under the influence of this surface ectoderm, under the influence of this optic cup, this surface ectoderm will develop a placard which is known as the lens placard. So, firstly, lens placard will develop. Later on, this lens placard will develop the lens vesicle. So, this vesicle will be detached from the surface ectoderm. This becomes the lens vesicle and this epithelium, surface ectoderm will again reform and this is the lens vesicle. And this lens vesicle come under the side of the optic cup. This is the optic cup and this is the lens vesicle. So in this way lens vesicle will be formed. The next question is asked about the lens fibers. There are almost two types of lens fibers. If we see, this is the lens vesicle. This one is the lens vesicle. The lens vesicle has an anterior epithelium which is of simple cuboidal cells, okay? And this one is the posterior wall of the lens. This is the anterior wall, and this one is the posterior wall of the lens. Anterior wall consists of the cuboidal cells, while the posterior wall consists of the columnar cells. These are the columnar cells with their nuclei. But later on, what will happen? The posterior wall epithelium, which is of columnar cells, will lose its nuclei. Nuclei will be lost, and this epithelium will be converted into the primary lens fibers. Now, there are also the secondary lens fibers which are present in the lens, which will be developed from the equatorial zone. This one is the equatorial zone of the lens, which is in the center almost, and the equatorial zone has the epithelium of cuboidal type. As I told you, the anterior wall have the cuboidal epithelium. Likewise, the equatorial zone also contains the cuboidal epithelial cells, and similarly, the cuboidal cells also lost their nuclei, and this epithelium will participate in the formation of the secondary lens fibers. So, I told you about the primary lens fibers and the secondary lens fibers. Primary lens fibers are formed by the columnar cells which were in the posterior wall. When they lose their nuclei, they are formed. And the secondary lens fibers are formed in the equatorial zone, and these are of cuboidal cells, okay? When they will lose, so in this way, secondary lens fibers are formed in the equatorial zone from the cuboidal epithelium. Likewise, in the development of the lens, there is development of a layer which is known as the vasculosa lentis. But later on, this vasculosa lentis layer also gets disappear. Only what will be left with the lens vesicle, that one is the capsule, lens capsule. Lens capsule will be in contact. with the optica. Now the next question is asked about the blood supply of the lens. Lens is a primarily it is attaining its blood supply from the hyaloid artery. What is hyaloid artery? As I told you, this is the choroid fissure in the optic stalk. Then the hyaloid artery is running in this hyaloid fissure. This hyaloid artery is supplying the optic curve and the lens vesicle also. Okay, so the primarily in the fetal life, the lens vesicle is attaining its blood supply from the hyaloid artery. But later on, what will happen? The hyaloid artery, this part, the distal part will be vanish, disappear. Only the proximal part will remain. So the distal part when disappear, this distal part is supplying the lens vesicle or the lens. So now in the later life, the lens become avascular. So if the MCQ comes, the lens is, then your option must be the lens is avascular. Okay, but early in the development, it has its blood supply from the hyaloid artery. Okay, then what happened to the proximal part of the hyaloid artery? The proximal part of the hyaloid artery is later on converted into the central artery of the retina. Central artery of the retina. So you should keep it in mind that the distal part of the hyaloid artery will disappear later on. So the lens become avascular, while the proximal part will be converted into the central artery of the retina. So you should also keep it in mind that the lens is a structure which is very prone to cataract, which is the white opacity, and mainly congenital cataract which is present in the children when they were born. This is due to the rubella infection. Rubella virus, this is the virus which is involved in the development of congenital cataract. I hope आपको लेंस की डेवलपमेंट भी समझ में आ गई होगी. Thank you.